Hello there, and welcome back to the channel. Mad Mike here, and today we are going to be doing another entry in the movie Spotlight series. And today we're going to be talking about an older film, and this is going to I'll let people know this in advance. This is going to kind of be a reoccurring theme with this series. Is that a lot of the films are going to be either horror related because a lot of the horror genre is very obscure and isn't really known a lot to the public, and a lot of them are going to be older films that maybe don't get as much attention as they deserve. And today we're going to be talking about kind of a mishmash of both, with The Thing from Another World, which is the original The Thing that John Carpenter remade in 1982. Now, this version was made in 1951, and it's credited as a director by Christian Nyby. But in actuality, it was ghost directed by Howard Hawks, who made such great films as Bringing Up Baby and The Big Sleep, among a lot of others. And he was actually a fairly prolific director in Hollywood through the 30s and 40s. And this is actually one of his later films, but for whatever reason, he was uncredited on this, and basically he ghost directed it. He was the executive producer. The film basically stars a bunch of no-name actors. Margaret Sheridan is really the only one of note, and then everybody else is kind of just there. And it's really not. The reason why I bring this film up and why I really love this film is because it's so interesting for the time period that it was made, because you're looking at an era where the Universal monster films were still relatively going strong. It hadn't gone into the Hammer horror films as much with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, and you were still in that kind of era where you could get away with these kind of goofy monster movies. Again, this is kind of before we moved into the nuclear age in the 50s, where you saw a lot of giant insect films like Them or Tarantula and stuff like that. And you really were still kind of staying with the basis of a monster. This was an alien in this scenario instead of just some creature that rose up from a swamp or something supernatural. This was extraterrestrial and science fiction. And really, it doesn't take a whole lot from the source material other than the setting and the idea that there's an alien running around killing people. And again, that's kind of very interesting when you look at it. If you've read or if you know of the source material, which is a short story called Who Goes There, that was written, I believe, in 1948. And the thing with this film is that you really do get the thing that none of the actors are really that recognizable. And that's kind of an interesting thing at the time, because a lot of horror actors at the time that were in a lot of movies were pretty recognizable. You obviously had your classics like Lon Chaney Jr. and Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff and people like that. You had Vincent Price, who was relatively he wasn't new at the time, but he was still up and coming. And you had a plethora of horror actors that really breathed life into the genre at the time, and it really wasn't that. It was well before the fall of horror in terms of great acting, where you had a lot of horror movies in later decades that would have relatively poor actors, and they would just kind of market it more on the violence as opposed to the acting and the story. And even though this movie does kind of have the acting isn't 100% stellar, it's still passable. And really the whole thing with it is that the idea of the movie is it's kind of just like goofily insane, but it works in a weird kind of way, where it's supposed to be a celery man from space that drinks human blood, and it's such a goofy premise, but for whatever reason it works in like a good way. There's also some interesting. The special effects in the movie aren't terrible. The makeup effects are not great, I will say that, but they're not great in kind of an amusing and funny way. And really, the thing is, if you like older sort of monster movies, if you like films that kind of show off that campiness from the time period where special effects weren't that good, but they kind of made up for it in other ways with better story and stuff like that. You'll probably like this movie. The special effects, again, I say, are not terrible. They actually do a really good scene where there is somebody who's lit completely on fire. And it's actually a really cool scene because the entire room essentially gets lit on fire. And it's really, really good in terms of just watching it, because obviously the guy was actually lit on fire. He was self-immolated. Or not self-immolated, he was immolated. But it's so amusing to watch because the guy actually, he still can act even though he's on fire, and he goes right through the room, and then he does all the stuff that he's supposed to do in the takes. And then I'm sure they had some people with fire extinguishers to put him out right off screen as soon as they got the take they wanted. I hope they didn't have to do more than one of those, because that probably would have sucked. But there are some kind of goofy things, and again, I like the movie more because it's kind of campy and kind of goofy, and it's not as well made as some other films. And if you're a film person and you kind of see that, normally you'd say this movie sucks. And it does suck from an objective point of view, but I enjoy it mostly just because it's of that kind of goofy aspect. And there's one particular thing where you can kind of tell, and it's in the production process, and I'm not 100% sure what it is, but I'm guessing that it's something involving the cameras, where when they switch in certain scenes, so they switch a camera angle. And when they switch the camera angle, you actually see that the camera quality will change when it changes an angle. So I don't know if they just had two different cameras and one was shitty and one wasn't. But it's kind of funny if you actually watch the movie and you pay really close attention to the detail in the cameras, because you can tell from scene to scene there must have been like one shitty camera they were using, or something like that, where like the reels weren't correct and they couldn't go back and refilm it, because the quality does drop a noticeable degree sometimes between cuts. And again, I just find that kind of goofy. And again, I more think of films from the 30s and the 40s as a bit more of a not so much of a guilty pleasure, because there are a lot of really good old films. But specifically films in the horror genre, kind of that goofy monster genre, they're almost like a guilty pleasure film. And if you really kind of like those older films and like those older movies, and you want to give something a watch and you haven't seen this, I'd recommend it 100%, because I think you will love it. And it hits all those right points. It has all the kind of stereotypical characters as the no-nonsense military guy, the damsel in distress, the banter between the best friends, the intellectual scientist that believes in the follies of man. It's really it hits kind of all those stereotypical points you can think of for a black and white monster movie, and it does it actually fairly well. So I'd recommend this. It's only an hour and a half long. It's relatively short. Films back then were not very long for the most part, especially in the horror genre. They didn't really get very long for a long time anyway, even if you look at the 80s. But check this out. It's actually a pretty good watch, and it's a fun little movie to see if you've never seen it before. So that ends my movie spotlight. Put down in the comments if you've seen this movie before, if you want to see it now that I've brought it to your attention. And leave a like on the video, hit the bell for notifications, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?